So I will at this point share my screen and begin our presentation. Again, thank you so much to everyone for attending. I appreciate you taking time out of your very busy weeks to listen to this presentation. So I am Fungai Machirori, but I'll tell you a little bit more about myself once I start the presentation. Is my screen visible to you at this point?
Yes, it's visible.
It is visible. All right. So this presentation will look at digital storytelling. And the way we're framing this is digital storytelling a new borderless trade for Africa? How might we think about digital storytelling as a means for telling new stories about the continent, and as well as a trade? Because I don't think we tend to think of trade in this way. We think of goods, services, and other skills as trade. However, digital storytelling has its own mechanisms for us to think about as a trade. And so this is what we're going to be looking at in this presentation. Before I go into too much detail about that, I think it's important for me to introduce myself. My name is Fungai Machirori. I am from Zimbabwe. I am a digital practitioner. I have many years of experience in producing, creating digital content and creating digital platforms. I have a history as a blogger some years ago. Many years ago, that's how I entered the digital world. I didn't find a space that was viable for me to speak about and express issues that were important to me. There was only the mainstream media at that point in time. And so I started to blog as a way to create an outlet for my own opinions and expressions. That eventually grew into other projects, which included Her Zimbabwe, which was a women's web-based platform, which was encouraging young women's digital storytelling. A very successful platform, which raised a lot of interest, but also trained a lot of young women in the skills around digital storytelling, blogging, digital security, and how to find your voice online. So you can learn a little bit more about me on my personal website, which is fungaimachirori.com. I've given that in the slide. So before we get a little bit more into the detail of this presentation, I think it's always important to start to understand or to create a collective understanding of what digital storytelling is. I don't think there are hard and fast rules about what we should consider to be digital storytelling. However, there is obviously the digital component to it, and there is the storytelling to it. Now, stories come in various shapes, forms, formats, and what I might consider a story might not necessarily be what somebody else considers a story. Nonetheless, a story is something that, creates an idea about something and narrates it to somebody else. So when we think about digital storytelling, we're thinking about this with the aid or the assistance of digital tools. This can be through blogging, through writing things, through taking videos of things, to recording things, podcasting. So vlogging as well comes under video, and photography, music, so many different formats and ways we can think about digital storytelling. And I think most importantly, so many different platforms and tools we can use for digital storytelling. And so I'll start this conversation at a very topical point. I think something that we all relate to because we experienced it. It feels a little bit now looking backwards as though COVID never really happened, and yet at the same time it did. It shifted so much about our lives. It brought us more into the digital space. And there were so many different conversation points that came about as a result of COVID. And one thing that was very apparent from the beginning of the pandemic, it started out mostly in the West, and for a little bit of time, Africa and Africans were spectators to what was going on, but we were also subjects of the content that people were creating about what would happen on the African continent. And in 2021, there was this very topical piece by the New York Times with the title, "A Continent Where the Dead Are Not Counted." Now that became a very topical issue. Brought a lot of controversy with it, with a lot of people pushing back against it, because the article imposed findings about Nigeria's COVID response and statistics thereof upon an entire continent of 54 countries. So, I mean, this collapsing of Africa into this one single entity and the creation of the idea that what happens in one place would happen across the continent was already very rife, and very much the same trope that has existed previously was being used and exploited again. Now, one really interesting response to that was by she's now older, but Sianda Mohutsiwa, a very young Botswana native who has been using the digital space for many years now and engaging around how young Africans use social media to push back and find their voices and engage. And so in the photograph that I've put in this slide, you will see this is Sianda in 2016 giving a TED Talk, which sits at over 1 million views today. And in this TED Talk, she's talking about how young Africans found a voice on Twitter. And so she's talking about a viral hashtag that she began at that time, which was "If Africa Was a Bar." I'm not sure if anyone remembers that, but it was a very interesting way that people started to engage around stereotypes about their own countries. So if Africa was a bar, what would the Zimbabwean be drinking? What would the Nigerian be doing? What would the Kenyan be saying? You know, so this very interesting way of thinking about nationality and people within this bar context. Anyway, Sianda put out a 22-tweet Twitter thread where she contrasted the New York Times coverage of Asia's COVID response, which she called good journalism, to that of their Africa coverage, which she critiqued for being unbalanced and reductive. I mean, we can already see that from the first slide that I shared. And this is from a report that was done last year by Nikabs and Ndlovu, where they looked at COVID coverage in greater detail. And we're trying to find out what the main themes were coming out of coverage about the continent during this time. And I'll quote from some of their findings, which say, just as with global coverage of Ebola and HIV and AIDS, the Western media outlets continued to report on Africa as a homogeneous entity and did not give attention to how COVID-19 was impacting differently in different countries, albeit that it gave some attention to South Africa, where death rates were high. So in a sense, everyone else was lumped together, and then South Africa sort of had a different life or a different experience of being covered within the COVID pandemic. And they go on to say that the media used words like could, will most certainly, will turn into, to prophesy doom for the continent, especially expressing doubt that the hospital infrastructure on the continent could cope. So in this time frame before the pandemic really hit the continent, there was all this talk about, well, you know, if the rest of the world is not able to cope, Africa is definitely going to collapse. So it was very pessimistic language and imagery that was constantly being evoked. And this feeds very well into this idea of Afro-pessimism. And Afro-pessimism is it's this pessimism about Africa's capacity to overcome developmental challenges which relate to health, development, governance, and poverty, among other issues. African crises, therefore, feed into this dominant representation of Africa and Africans as the dark continent characterized by incompetence. And I just put up a photo there of a cover some years ago by the Economist magazine, where they had framed Africa as the hopeless continent. You see a man there with his machine gun, you know, there's darkness around him and just the silhouette of Africa. So it's again this idea, all there is war and hopelessness and death. And yet, if we look again at this moment, this COVID moment, and think a little bit about what happened, you know, in the narrative, in what was produced and generated by Africans, it's very interesting how that subverts this very dark Afro-pessimistic narrative. So I'm sure many of you would have encountered the Ghana pallbearers or the dancing pallbearers at some point during the pandemic, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. If you went on social media at that time and people were trying to encourage people to wash their hands or stay at home, you would have these Ghanaian pallbearers copied into the video or brought in some way as lurkers who were waiting for you to do the wrong thing, so that, if you did do the wrong thing, you would die. And, this is a very interesting group of people. They had appeared on the BBC before the pandemic. And what they do is they have this very elaborate dance routine that they perform at funerals, where they would carry the coffin of the deceased over their shoulders, and they would be, sort of dancing around and making these very daring moves, at a funeral. And so people found that very interesting. And again, this content just emerged at that time. And so they were being brought into public health messaging, and they were being brought into content of a humorous nature to try to encourage people to stay at home, or else, they would come and dance at your funeral in this way. And so dancing pallbearers was mentioned at least 60,000 times by English-speaking Twitter in April 2020. And this is at just the beginning of the pandemic, and garnered more search queries for the term than in the previous history of Twitter altogether. So obviously it was a new term, it was a new craze. And so people were really interested to see what was going on. And so they were able to get a lot of virality through their content. But the group also appeared on official public health messaging in countries such as Brazil. There were actual billboards that the Brazilian government had put out with their image saying, you need to be safe, or else these guys are coming to visit you. So that shows some of the impact of African content at this time, that, everyone thought, well, these Africans are all going to fall off, die, and, there will be no continent left to speak of. Another really interesting trend is the Jerusalem Dance Challenge. Now, this was something that was almost choreographed so perfectly for the pandemic. It starts out with this gospel song that comes out of South Africa, and then there is an Angolan dance troupe. This is pre-COVID, who start to choreograph this dance sequence to this song. And it's very socially distant. This is pre-COVID, but then it's socially distant. And, people can participate in it together, but apart. And so obviously when the pandemic hits, people are in their homes and they're very tired of being in their homes. They want to socialize, but they also want to respect the mandates of social distancing and other things. And so what people then do is start dancing to this dance challenge, the Jerusalem Dance Challenge, where they come together in these groups in socially distant ways, and the song is playing, and they're following this choreography of the Angolan dancers who had made the content go viral on the continent. So by October 2020, a few months into the trend, content with the Jerusalem Challenge hashtag had almost 200 million TikTok views, with the song itself gaining over 1 billion video views and soundtracking over 800 million creations of the same platform. That was massive. Everyone got on board with that dance challenge. It just went global and viral. And it's very interesting to think how a gospel song in Zulu, which very few people would understand outside of South Africa and maybe some parts of Southern Africa, could go so viral internationally. And also we can see, when we look at some of the activism that happened at that same time, similar kinds of virality, intercontinental sharing of content and things going on. One of those most popular activism moments was the End SARS campaign, which started towards the end of 2020, when Nigerians took to social media, challenging the police and brutality that the police were meting out on citizens. And, that became a very, very big moment for digital activism on the continent. Nigeria, with its great numbers of people, its great numbers of influencers outside of Nigeria as well, who were able to push this hashtag outside of Nigeria into the greater world, and shed light on something that very few people outside of Nigeria might have known about. And so that was a very viral moment that fed into a lot of other activist causes and movements, one of which was Zimbabwean Lives Matter. Now, just to take it a step back, I think there's something to be said about how Black Lives Matter, which resurfaced in 2020, had then created this kind of conversation point where people started to talk about police brutality, and they started to use the language of Black Lives Matter to talk about their own causes. So NSAS is, very much linked in certain ways to Black Lives Matter with its discussions about police brutality. But Zimbabwean Lives Matter takes on the kind of language of Black Lives Matter and says, well, if Black Lives Matter, Zimbabwean lives matter too. And that was also a viral moment where Zimbabweans came online and were discussing a lot of the brutality that they're experiencing at the hands of the government and the state of affairs in the country. And so that was equally interesting, not as big an audience, obviously, as Nigeria. Nigeria is exponentially bigger to Zimbabwe. And I think one thing that's really interesting to take note of about the Zimbabwean Lives Matter is that it sort of started to go very viral at a certain moment. And that moment had a lot to do with the now late rapper, AKA. He put out a tweet early in August, and he said, imagine your fellow Africans too busy focused on Black Lives Matter happening 15,000 kilometers away to care about those very same Black lives next door. Black is my king, stay strong, Zimbabwe. So he was putting all these kinds of tweets out, but he had started with a question and said, what is going on in Zimbabwe? And then Zimbabwe started to tweet back to him. And then this moment started to get very viral. And other South African influencers started to get involved. Now, Zimbabwe is a very small country, under 20 million people. South Africa, much larger than that. And it almost needed that this narrative needed to go into South Africa, to migrate to South Africa, to become viral enough in South Africa to assist the Zimbabwean cause. And so that's when we talk about borderless trade, these ideas, how things can go viral actually from another place and then come back to where they came from initially, is a very interesting dynamic, especially when we think about the dynamics of countries with smaller populations. Now, this is a tweet that was put out around that time, or a little bit later on, by Doug Coltart, who is a legal professional in Zimbabwe. And he says, wow, check out the top trends in Zimbabwe today. This is real Pan-Africanism, Africans standing in solidarity with fellow Africans. So this is the trend of hashtags that were most viral in Zimbabwe on that day. And you see that you have NSAS, you have Congo is bleeding, you have Zimbabwean Lives Matter, you have Anglophone crisis, and you have rape national emergency, shut it all down, am I next? So there were all these different kinds of causes happening. In South Africa, there was a lot of conversations about the murders of women by their intimate partners and things like that. And so all these kinds of hashtags started to sit together. Anglophone crisis had sort of been moving for a while. It's this issue of in Cameroon of the separations of Francophone Cameroon and Anglophone Cameroon. And so all these hashtags started to meet each other and converge and help each other to become viral in places they might not have become viral. And in a sense, people started to know more about issues beyond their own borders and to engage with them because, there was a kind of trade. You are putting my word out there, but I'm also putting your word out there. So we're helping each other to have our mutual issues listened to and dealt with or addressed. So we can think about digital storytelling in many ways, but I like to think of it as a powerful trade. It's a powerful way of exchanging ideas. It nurtures Pan-African ideals and principles. It enables Africans to learn more about their continent and each other. It enables content that might not otherwise have gone viral to do so, especially when countries with bigger audiences get involved, like I've shown with Zimbabwean Lives Matter and South Africa. It also enables this borderless solidarity. There is, a lot of times we hold dearly to the idea of our national identities, our borders, but at the same time, there's this conversations we are always having about how the borders of the continent are not constructed by Africans. They are a colonial legacy. And so when we have these ideas that travel across the continent, it then foments this borderless solidarity and this Pan-Africanism that, all these post-colonial states and statespeople wanted to bring about on the continent. So we need to now think as well about digital storytelling as this powerful trait for ourselves as communications practitioners. And now I'm framing this from a very activist and entertainment level to our communications practices. And the reason why I started with those examples was because I think they're very relatable. We all went through the COVID pandemic and we all kind of know what kept us sane or somewhat sane at that point in time. And so I think it's relatable in that way. But now I want to frame it to a more comms perspective to get us to think about some questions that we might want to think through in our digital storytelling as communications practitioners, as organizations, as collectives, as individuals. And so here's just a few questions I have to pose. How can we as communications practitioners engage in digital storytelling across borders? It doesn't always have to be activism. It doesn't always have to be entertainment, but how can we start thinking about telling each other stories in the hopes that, you gain an audience that you might otherwise not have, and vice versa. The other people also gain an audience that they might otherwise not have. What storylines in our national work overlap with other contexts? So many of us, I'm sure, would be working within national contexts, but we might have information that goes beyond the borders of our countries. How could we bring those conversation points into something that was wider than just focusing on one issue or the issue at hand in that context? Because I think issues tend to emerge, they come and then they go and then they come again. But then once they've gone from one's national context, they might be topical in another context as well. So if you want to keep a storyline going about something, for instance, I'm just taking this off the top of my head, if there's flooding in a place, I mean, we've seen flooding in different parts of the continent. We know that climate change is an issue. And if you want to keep a storyline going about a climate change theme, for example, it might not be something that's happening in that context at that time, but it's happening somewhere else in the continent. And you can paint this bigger picture of this is the bigger picture issue. It's affecting us here in these ways, but sometimes it's affecting other people in these ways, but it's still the same underlying theme or storyline. So to think about the continuous nature of a narrative versus the events-based nature of narratives, which tends to be how we do our work, because we respond to things as and when they come. But sometimes there is that value in thinking about, well, this is an issue that affects different groups of people. How can we embed it into our storyline so that even if it is not nationally contextual at that time, we're still talking about it? And also, how can we make country offices operations more engaged with what happens with other country offices? So if you're working for a big international organization or a regional organization, and there's country offices, and it tends to happen that the country offices focus on what happens in their countries. But then again, going back to that point just before, how can we have storylines where we actually start to feed in or feed from other contexts and bring together this richer narrative about an issue rather than just looking at it from a national context? Also, how can we use our social media platforms more effectively for solidarity building and knowledge sharing? For example, using different hashtags and single posts, retweeting or liking or sharing or commenting. I think, the example I showed of these hashtags that went viral at the same time because people were using them simultaneously. It goes back to, I'm just thinking of this quote that says, we don't live single issue lives. Our lives are never about one single thing. We're multifaceted and there are always multiple things happening at a time. And so how to think about when we post content to not just be focused on this one hashtag or this one issue that's happening or this one context that we know about, but to bring other contexts, to bring other voices, to bring other issues in, and to make it a larger narrative. And then what other tools do we have at our disposal? Going back to what digital storytelling is, social media is the big one. At the moment, it's the easiest, it's one of the easier ones as well to provide examples of, but there are so many other digital tools and platforms that we have at our disposal that we can use to tell our stories and to share them. So to think broadly and not just focusing always on social media and social media reach. So that's a little bit about the digital storytelling as the trade. I think it's also important to introduce what we do. I have my assistant on this call. He's the one who is letting you into the room and handling all of those things that I can't do right now because I'm presenting. We run a platform called the Digitally Native Platform. We started with a podcast. It started with a podcast, and then it became a bigger thinking about, well, what is missing from the space and what can we offer? I have, as I said already, many years in the space, and I'm always engaged in digital themes and topics. So the podcast looks at digitality from an African standpoint. We try to discuss issues and themes from an African perspective. There's all these conversations about where the future of social media is, but we don't tend to have a voice from the African continent. I think at the beginning of the year, there was the Twitter exodus conversation. A lot of people were leaving Twitter to join other platforms or to completely disengage. And I asked a few people, well, would you leave Twitter? And people said, no way, I won't leave Twitter because, that's where I find my news, my information, and some of my community. So I think when we think about some of these themes and issues that are happening in the broader world, there isn't always a contextual idea about how they affect Africa and Africans. And so you'll see even in the banner, there's a conversation there. The last episode we uploaded is a conversation with the TikTok Sub-Saharan Africa office to get an idea of, well, what are you doing on the continent and what is the conversation about the TikTok? There's this whole conversation about TikTok potentially being banned in a lot of Western countries. How does that affect us as Africans? Are we part of that conversation? Are we at risk? What is the policy outlook of TikTok on the African continent? So always trying to bring it back to the African context. I've done research around what I've just talked about in greater detail. It's got a bit more of an academic name when I talk about it in those spaces, but it's what I call African digital cosmopolitanism. And it's, redefining this global citizenship through young African digital narratives. So this is a report I produced for Africa No Filter last year. And it's just basically looking at some of these dance trends and different viral moments and saying, well, does this not challenge the idea that information always flows from the Western world to Africa? Sometimes, and a lot of the times, Africans are producers of this content that goes viral, and different countries help each other to create that virality, and then it goes out into the greater world, and then we have these moments where everyone is listening to what is going on the continent. So our services as the Digitally Native Platform, we do digital storytelling. We help clients to figure out what their story is and how they want to present it in the digital space. We also help with strategic communications planning, monitoring, and evaluation, as well as research and documentation. To get in touch with us, to learn a little bit more about what we do, you can visit our website, which is www.digitallynativepodcast.com. You can also email us at info@digitallynativepodcast.com. We're on Twitter @nativepodcast. You can also find us on Facebook or LinkedIn, the Digitally Native Podcast with Fungai Machirori. And that is a wrap. Thank you very much for listening.